Have you ever wondered why the kindest people often carry the heaviest silence? Why the one who comforts everyone is the one no one checks on? Why the one who senses everything, the subtle shift in tone, the shadow in someone's eyes, is always the one who ends up bleeding quietly behind a smile? We call them empaths. But that word, so often thrown around, conceals something far more ancient, far more dangerous than people realize. Because a true empath is not someone who merely feels a lot. No, a true empath is someone whose psyche was trained in emotional warfare without ever going to battle. They learned to sense tension before it spoke, to read a room like scripture, to hold pain that was never theirs, just to keep the peace. Not because they were born fragile, but because somewhere along the line, love became something they had to earn. But here's what no one tells you. Empathy is not innocence. Empathy is not the absence of shadow. In fact, the deepest empaths carry the darkest shadows. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And the empath has paid that price. Repeatedly, they have walked through betrayal with open hearts. They have swallowed rage to preserve relationships. They have absorbed manipulation and called it forgiveness. They have denied their own truth again and again, just to keep someone else comfortable. So let me ask you, what happens when the empath has had enough? What happens when the one who never raised their voice decides silence is no longer strength, but suppression? What happens when the one who gave endlessly finally turns inward and says, "No more"? Most people assume that anger is loud, that power arrives with thunder. But Jung taught us otherwise. The most terrifying transformation is the one that happens quietly, when the soul reclaims what it gave away too freely. And in that moment, the empath is no longer someone you can use. They are no longer a mirror for your projection. They are no longer the canvas for your chaos. They have seen the shadow, not just yours, their own, and they did not flinch. They did not look away. They integrated it. And now, what stands before you is not a kind person. It is someone whole, and wholeness cannot be manipulated, not with guilt, not with love, not with fear. That is what makes a fed-up empath the most dangerous presence in any room. Not because they want to destroy you, but because finally, they have no desire to save you. Have you ever wondered why the most sensitive people seem to suffer the most? Why, no matter how deeply they love, how much they understand, how fully they give, they still find themselves entangled in betrayal, manipulation, abandonment? Are they weak? Carl Jung would say, no, not weak, just not yet awakened. The empath is a soul born with emotional antenna tuned to the pain of others. They feel what's not spoken. They understand what hasn't even been explained. But without inner clarity, that gift becomes a trap. They lose track of where their emotions end and someone else's begin. They carry wounds that were never theirs. They try to save people who don't want to be saved, while quietly bleeding themselves dry. They become the healer for everyone, but forget they are also allowed to break, to feel anger, to be selfish in a sacred human way. Jung called this the stage of identification with the persona, the public mask of kindness, compassion, the good listener, the strong one, which often hides a forgotten, repressed truth crying out beneath the surface. But masks crack, and when life delivers that final blow, a betrayal too brutal to ignore, a silence too loud to bear, the empath doesn't collapse. They awaken, not in a burst of rage, but in a quiet clarity. They begin to see the pattern. They understand that they weren't really in love with that person. They were trying to heal the wound that person represented. They realized they weren't truly betrayed. They were being called home. Carl Jung called this moment the beginning of individuation, the soul's journey toward wholeness. The sacred unraveling of roles, masks, unconscious programs, so one may return to the self, Not the self that pleases, performs, or protects, but the one that simply is. The empath now steps out of emotional victimhood. They stop drowning in feelings and begin learning to breathe beneath them. They don't react impulsively to please others. They respond deliberately to honor themselves. And this shift changes everything. They no longer seek permission to feel. They no longer explain their no. They no longer apologize for taking up space, because they are no longer just someone who feels deeply. They are someone who knows deeply, and that knowing is the beginning of true psychological power. There comes a turning point in every empath's journey, a quiet shift so profound that no one notices it except the ones who can no longer manipulate them. It's the moment when the empath awakens, not the kind of awakening that's loud, explosive, or dramatic. It's the kind that unfolds like a slow dawn after years of darkness. Carl Jung understood this transformation deeply. He wrote that the most integrated individuals are those who have faced their shadow and emerged whole. And when the empath, tired of being betrayed, drained, dismissed, finally turns inward, something irreversible begins to happen. They no longer fear their darkness, the anger they once suppressed, the boundaries they were afraid to draw, the voice they silenced to keep the peace. All return, not as weapons, but as sacred instruments of discernment. Where once they reacted from pain, they now respond from presence. The narcissist, the manipulator, the emotional vampire, they don't understand what's changed. They keep pressing the same buttons, expecting the same collapse, the same apologetic backtrack, the same emotional chase. But now, the empath doesn't flinch. They don't explain. They don't argue. They don't play. Because they've left the game entirely. Jung called this psychological autonomy, the state where the self no longer needs validation from outside. It is wholeness reclaimed. The empath, once emotionally porous, becomes centered, not closed off, but immune. They've learned that compassion does not mean self-erasure, that love without boundaries is not virtue. It's a leak. That saying no is not cruel. It's an act of self-respect. And in this grounded strength, they stop being attractive to manipulators. Not because they've become cold, but because they now radiate something terrifying to those who seek control: clarity. Empaths who've integrated their shadow are no longer confused by charm, guilt, or performance. They see, not through emotion, but through essence. They no longer ask, "What's wrong with me?" They now ask, "Why am I still standing here?" This is not the birth of cruelty. It is the end of unconscious participation, because when the empath wakes up, they stop being the mirror others use to avoid themselves. They become the reflection of truth. And the truth, as Jung knew, is the most disruptive force in any system built on illusion. It's not that they stopped caring, it's that they started choosing. The empath, once a vessel for everyone else's emotions, has begun to sense something rare stirring inside, a kind of stillness, a kind of clarity, a kind of power that no longer flinches when met with chaos. Carl Jung wrote of appropriate response. Not the knee-jerk reaction of the wounded, not the silence of the fearful, but a response born of awareness, measured, precise, whole. And when the empath reaches this level of inner clarity, they no longer act from their pain, they act from wisdom. They've learned the hardest lesson: you don't have to fight to prove anything to anyone. You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to stay to be loyal. You simply have to be true. And in that truth, something radical changes. They become strategic, not manipulative, not cold, but discerning. Like a river that no longer floods for the sake of every thirsty traveler. They know where their energy goes. They sense when they are being baited. They recognize when forgiveness is being demanded, not earned. And so, they stop giving their medicine to those who spit it out. They stop explaining their boundaries to those who only seek to bend them. They stop apologizing for the space they take up, because now they understand. That space was always theirs to begin with. When the world expected tears, they offer silence. When provoked, they offer nothing but distance. When baited into old roles, they choose presence over performance. They no longer need closure. They create it. They no longer crave apologies. They walk away before the damage asks for repair. They no longer wait to be chosen. They choose themselves, again and again, with a steadiness no storm can shake. This is the pivot point. The transition from being emotionally reactive to becoming emotionally sovereign. And it is here that the empath becomes unreadable to those who once fed off their transparency. They're not being rude. They're being deliberate. They're not being distant. They're being precise. They're not punishing you. They've simply withdrawn their light, and with it, your illusion of control. This is not revenge. This is evolution. Because they've realized the greatest victory was never in getting someone to finally see their worth. It was in finally seeing it for themselves. And now, they give only what is respected, offer only what is reciprocated, and share only what cannot be used against them. That, Carl Jung knew, is the essence of individuation. To no longer be a character in someone else's story, but to become the conscious author of your own. They never stopped loving. They simply started loving with intention. The empath, once flooded by the emotions of others, now moves like water, calm, deep, and deliberate. Not every hand deserves to drink from their stream. Not every wound is theirs to bandage. This isn't bitterness, it's refinement. Their sensitivity, once a raw nerve exposed to every storm, has been forged into discernment. Carl Jung would call this the feeling function matured, no longer a passive receptor of emotional chaos, but a precise compass that navigates the inner and outer world with stunning clarity. The empath begins to ask questions they never dared ask before. Is this connection mutual? Does my giving create balance or dependency? Am I being loved for who I am, or for the role I play in their survival? And in the quiet that follows those questions, the truth becomes unmistakable. They realize some people were never relating, only extracting. Some souls weren't companions, but containers for projection. Some bonds weren't built on love, but on need, control, or unresolved trauma. And so, the empath does something radical. They stop pouring into black holes disguised as people. They begin to choose where their energy flows. Where once they chased, they now observe. Where once they rescued, they now witness. Where once they overextended, they now conserve. This isn't a retreat from love. It's a return to sacred love. They no longer believe that to be kind is to say yes to everything. They understand now. Boundaries are not walls. They are thresholds of self-respect. They offer their presence where it is honored. They open their heart where it is met with care. And they walk away, without drama, without bitterness, when the soul across from them chooses distortion over truth. Because they've learned. Just as they were once magnetized to brokenness, they can now become a beacon for wholeness. Not because they've become perfect, but because they've stopped leaking. They do not love less. They love wiser. They do not forgive less. They forgive fully, but they remember. And they no longer return to places that confused their compassion for weakness. Their love becomes a sanctuary, not a battlefield. And in this sacred discernment, they find something they never thought possible: peace without explanation, depth without depletion, connection without collapse. Carl Jung spoke of the individuated soul as one who no longer seeks to be everything for everyone, but becomes wholly, unapologetically themselves. And so, the empath evolves. Not into someone harder, colder, or distant, but into someone rooted. They choose fewer people, but connect more deeply. They speak less often, but with greater weight. They give more freely, but only where the soil is fertile. Because now they know their light is not meant to illuminate every path, only the ones that walk beside them with reverence. There comes a moment, quiet, but irreversible, when the empath stops being shaped by the world and begins shaping their place within it. This is not ego. This is emergence. Carl Jung called it the return to the self, not the mask we show the world, not the bruised persona shaped by survival, but the deep, unwavering essence that was there before we were taught to hide it. For the empath who has walked through fire, betrayed by those they loved, used by those they trusted, doubted by those they believed in, this moment is nothing short of alchemical, because what didn't destroy them transformed them. They've metabolized pain into power. They've turned betrayal into inner sight. And now they carry a kind of silence that cannot be disturbed, a presence that cannot be manipulated. They are no longer reactive. They are no longer apologetic. They are no longer waiting for someone else to validate what their soul already knows. They have become what Jung would call a force of nature, not through domination, but through wholeness, because they have integrated their shadow. They've touched the darkest parts of their psyche and reclaimed the gold buried beneath. And that, more than any armor, makes them untouchable. You can't control someone who no longer needs your approval. You can't guilt someone who's made peace with their boundaries. You can't manipulate someone who sat with their own pain and lived. The empath is no longer the echo of other people's projections. They've become a presence so rooted that it unsettles those who depended on their weakness. But this isn't about vengeance. This is about sovereignty. They've stopped trying to save those who enjoy drowning. They've stopped explaining their worth to ears that only listen to themselves. They've stopped offering their light to those who mistake it for a spotlight. Now they walk with reverence for their own depth, for their own sensitivity, for the wisdom that was born in the fire. They no longer fear being alone because they've come home to themselves. Carl Jung believed that the greatest transformation is not found in changing the world, but in integrating all that lives within us. The empath, awakened and whole, is no longer a puzzle missing pieces. They are the full mosaic. They are not seeking completion, they are completion. And in this state they become what cannot be predicted, what cannot be broken, what cannot be used, not hardened, but purified, not passive, but powerful, not loud, but unmistakably present. This is not the end of their story, it's the end of their self-betrayal. And from here, everything changes. You don't have to wait for the world to understand you. You don't have to prove your softness has strength. You do. In this life, you will meet people who drain your light, who mistake your empathy for compliance, who puss. But now you know. That moment of quiet clarity, when you stop chasing, stop X is the moment. This isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming clear. It's not about shutting Pio. It's about no. Carl Jung taught us that true freedom isn't found in escaping pain, but in integrating it, using it. And so today, you don't need to scream your worth. You don't need to defend your heart. You simply need to begin choosing yourself. Eve, say no when your soul whispers no. Withdraw your energy from what depletes you. Let your boundaries speak louder than your explanations. The more you honor your truth, the more your world will begin to reflect it. And one day, without drama or noise, you'll realize you've become someone no one can break, because you are no longer divided within. You have become whole. If this journey resonated with something buried deep inside you, if you felt seen in the silence, named in the shadows, and strengthened by the truth, then this space was made for you. Subscribe if your heart feels called. Not for numbers, not for algorithms, but because you're ready to walk this path of awakening together. Share it with someone who needs to remember who they are beneath the pain. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more people who've made peace with their depth. And if that's you, welcome home.